10 million. Let that number sink in for a second. 10 million steel spikes, each one driven by hand, 3 swings of a 10-pound hammer, straight through a railroad tie and into the American frontier. No machines, no pneumatic drivers, just men, hammers, and the stubborn refusal to believe that mountains, deserts, and 2,000 miles of wilderness could stop progress. Every spike that connected California to Nebraska was driven by muscle, blood, and the kind of repetitive brutality that breaks a man's body one swing at a time. The year is 1863. Congress has just passed the Pacific Railroad Act, authorizing 2 companies to build the first railroad across the continent. The Central Pacific starts in Sacramento, pushing east through the Sierra Nevada. The Union Pacific starts in Omaha, pushing west across the plains. Where they meet, America changes forever. But first, someone has to drive the spikes, millions of them. And the men who'll do it don't know yet that their names will be erased from history, that their bodies will be buried in unmarked graves, that the only thing connecting them to the railroad they built will be the steel they hammered into the ground until their hands bled. Before we talk about those men, you need to understand the math. The brutal, simple arithmetic of building a railroad by hand. Each rail is 30 feet long, takes 10 spikes to secure it to the ties beneath. 2 rails make a track. That's 20 spikes for every 30 feet. Keep going. There are 400 rails in a mile. That's 4,000 spikes per mile minimum. But that's just the rails. You've also got splice bars connecting each rail section. More spikes. You've got curves that need extra reinforcement. More spikes. You've got switches and sidings. More spikes. When you add it all up, a single mile of track requires somewhere between 9,000 and 13,000 spikes. And the Transcontinental Railroad is 1,907 miles long. Do the math. That's 18 million spikes. 18 million times a man had to bend down, position a spike, raise a hammer, and drive steel through wood. 18 million times a hammer had to come down with enough force to penetrate a railroad tie made of hardwood that could crack an amateur's wrist if he hit it wrong. And every single one of those spikes was driven by hand. Because in 1863, there was no other way. The men who would drive those spikes started arriving in 1864. For the Central Pacific in California, they came from China. From the Pearl River Delta region of Guangdong Province. From villages where civil war, famine, and poverty had made life unbearable. They'd heard about California during the gold rush, heard that America was a place where a man could make money and send it home to family. What they didn't hear about was the Sierra Nevada, or the fact that the railroad company saw them as disposable. Charles Crocker ran construction for the Central Pacific. When he couldn't find enough white workers willing to do the job, he started hiring Chinese immigrants, not because he respected them, because he was desperate. He paid them $26 a month in 1864. That's about $500 in today's money. The white workers doing the exact same job, they made $35 a month plus food and housing. What the Chinese workers had to pay for their own food and tents out of that $26, and they got the most dangerous work. The blasting, the cliff-hanging, the tunneling through solid granite where one miscalculation with black powder could bury you alive. The winter of 1866 to 1867 was one of the worst on record. Snow fell 40 feet deep in the High Sierra. Avalanches swept down mountainsides without warning, burying entire work camps. Workers died in their sleep when snowslides crushed the bunkhouses they'd built for shelter. In some areas, the Chinese workers carved tunnels through the snow itself, creating a network of passages that connected work sites to living quarters. They worked underground in a frozen labyrinth, digging through ice and snow just to reach the rock they needed to blast through. The tunnels through the mountains were a special kind of hell. Summit Tunnel, the longest on the route, took 15 months to complete. Workers attacked it from both ends and from a shaft sunk in the middle. They drilled by hand, using steel bits and sledgehammers to bore holes for explosives. The rock was granite, solid, hard, unforgiving. Black powder was the only explosive available, and it was nowhere near as powerful as the dynamite that would come later. So progress was measured in inches per day, sometimes just inches per week. Workers hung in wicker baskets lowered from ropes anchored at the top of cliffs. They'd dangle hundreds of feet above valleys, drilling holes and placing charges. knowing that when they lit the fuse, they had maybe 30 seconds to give the signal to be hauled back up before the blast went off. So if the men pulling the ropes were slow, if the rope broke, if anything went wrong, the workers in the baskets died. No parachute, no safety equipment, just rope and hope. By 1867, 90% of the Central Pacific workforce was Chinese, somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 men. Their names weren't recorded. The company kept no personnel files, no death certificates, no records of who these men were or where they came from. When a man died, his body was shipped back to China if his friends could afford it. If not, he was buried where he fell. Sometimes in avalanches, sometimes in explosions, sometimes from exhaustion, silicosis, or accidents that happened so fast there wasn't time to scream. And in June of 1867, they'd had enough. Thousands of Chinese workers in the Sierra Nevada walked off the job. It was the largest labor strike in the United States up to that point. They had a list of demands: equal pay with white workers, an 8-hour workday instead of 12, an end to being docked pay for weather delays, the right to refuse the most dangerous assignments, basic human dignity. Charles Crocker's response was simple and brutal. He cut off their food supply. The Chinese workers had set up their own camps and purchased their own provisions, but those provisions came through company suppliers. Crocker told the suppliers to stop selling food to the strikers. He threatened to hire other workers to replace them, though everyone knew he couldn't find replacements with their skill and work ethic. And after a week of starvation tactics, the strike collapsed. The workers went back to their positions. Nothing changed. They still made less money, they still worked longer hours, they still got the most dangerous assignments, but they'd made their point. They'd proven they could organize. They'd shown that they understood their value to the project. It wasn't enough to change the system, but it was enough to terrify the railroad companies into making sure Chinese workers never organized like that again. We don't know exactly how many died. Estimates run from 1,000 to 2,000. Maybe more for every 100 Chinese workers who came to build the railroad. Somewhere between 5 and 10 never went home. 1 in 10. Those are battlefield casualty rates, and they died building something that wasn't supposed to kill them, but did anyway, because speed mattered more than safety, and profit mattered more than lives. Here's what it took to drive a spike. You're standing next to a railroad tie that's just been laid on a bed of gravel ballast. The tie is 8.5 feet long, 10 inches wide, made of hardwood that's been treated with creosote to resist rot. Your job is to secure a 560-pound rail to that tie using spikes that are 5.5 inches long and weigh half a pound each. You've got a tool called a spike maul. It's a hammer with an asymmetrical head. One end is larger than the other. The handle is 3 feet long. The whole thing weighs 10 pounds. You've been swinging this hammer since sunrise. It's now mid-afternoon. Your hands are wrapped in cloth because the blisters broke hours ago, and now it's just raw meat gripping wood. Your back is screaming. Your shoulders feel like someone's driving nails through the joints. And you've got 800 more spikes to drive before the foreman lets you stop for the day. You grasp the maul with both hands, slightly apart to prevent rubbing. You position the spike, you swing. The maul comes down, the large end of the head connects with the spike. And if you hit it right, the spike sinks 2 inches into the wood. You swing again, another 2 inches, third swing. The spike is home, the head flush with the tie plate. 3 swings per spike. That's the rhythm. 3 strokes to the spike, 10 spikes to a rail, 20 spikes for 30 feet of track. Walk forward, do it again, and again, and again, for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, for as long as the railroad keeps pushing forward. A good track gang could lay a 1/4 mile of track in a day. That's about 2,500 spikes. If you're one of 8 spikers in the crew, that's 312 spikes per man per day, 936 hammer swings, assuming you never miss, assuming the wood doesn't split and force you to pull the spike and start over, assuming you don't hit your hand instead of the spike because your arms are so tired you can barely lift the maul anymore. The sound was like a battle. The ring of hammers on steel echoed across the plains and through the mountains. Thousands of men swinging thousands of hammers. The rhythm so synchronized, it sounded like a single massive heartbeat. 3 beats per spike. A pause. 3 more beats. Over and over. Some crews sang to keep the rhythm, work songs that helped men coordinate their swings and forget for a moment how much their bodies hurt. Dr. William Abraham Bell, a newspaper correspondent traveling with the railroad crews in 1866, described it as a grand anvil chorus played in triple time. 3 strokes to the spike, he wrote. There are 10 spikes to a rail, 400 rails to a mile, 1,800 miles to San Francisco. 21 million times those sledges must be swung. 21 million times they must come down with their sharp punctuation before the great work of modern America is complete. He watched the track gangs work and tried to capture what he was seeing. Less than 30 seconds to a rail for each gang, he wrote. 4 rails go down to the minute. Close behind the first gang come the gaugers, spikers, and bolters, and a lively time they make of it. The coordination required was extraordinary. The rail layers would drop a 30-foot section of iron rail into position. Behind them, the gaugers would check to make sure the distance between rails was exactly 4 feet 8.5 inches, standard gauge. Too wide and trains would derail. Too narrow and they couldn't run at all. Behind the gaugers came the spikers with their mauls. They'd position the spikes through holes in tie plates that distributed the weight and held the rail at the correct angle. Then the hammering would start. Synchronized, rhythmic, relentless. A veteran spiker could tell you by the sound whether a spike was going in clean or if the wood was splitting. A dull thud meant you'd hit good wood and the spike was sinking true. A sharp crack meant the tie was starting to fail and you'd need to move the spike to a different spot. A metallic ring meant you'd miss the spike entirely and hit the rail or the tie plate instead. Do that too many times, and the foreman would replace you with someone who could actually aim. One of those men might have been named John Henry. You've heard the song. The legend of the steel-driving man who raced a steam drill and won, then died with his hammer in his hand. Most people think it's just a story. It's not. There was a real John Henry, 19 years old, born in New Jersey, came to Virginia after the Civil War, like a lot of young black men looking for work in the chaos of Reconstruction. Got arrested in 1866 for theft. Probably a wrongful conviction under Virginia's black codes, laws specifically designed to criminalize freed slaves and put them back into forced labor. John Henry was sentenced to 10 years in the Virginia penitentiary, became prisoner number 497, and like hundreds of other convicts, he was leased out to the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad to work on the Lewis Tunnel through the Appalachian Mountains. His job was steel driving, not railroad spikes, bigger spikes, drilling holes into solid rock for explosives. A man called a shaker would hold a steel drill bit against the rock face. John Henry would swing a 20-pound sledgehammer, hitting that drill bit over and over, driving it inch by inch into the mountain while the shaker rotated the bit after each strike. It was the same rhythm as spike driving, but heavier, more dangerous. One missed swing, and you'd shatter your partner's hands. The dust in the tunnels was thick enough to choke on. Silicosis killed more miners and tunnel workers than accidents did, but it killed slower, so the companies didn't count it in their statistics. Between 1870 and 1872, John Henry worked the Lewis Tunnel, and somewhere in there, he died. Maybe in a race against a steam drill, like the song says, maybe from exhaustion, maybe from dust inhalation. We don't know for sure, but we know he existed, and we know he was one of hundreds of convict laborers who died building railroads they'd never ride. The Transcontinental Railroad connected with men like John Henry at every joint and every spike. Free workers, convict workers, Chinese immigrants, Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, both Union and Confederate, freed slaves, Mormon settlers near the end when the two lines converged in Utah, all of them swinging hammers, all of them driving spikes, and all of them expendable in the eyes of the men who owned the railroad companies. The Union Pacific, building west from Nebraska, hired mostly Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans. The Irish came from the same poverty the Chinese fled. Famine in Ireland had killed 1 million people and forced another 1 million to emigrate. The ones who came to work on the railroad were tough, experienced, and organized enough to demand decent wages. They made $35 a month, same as the white workers on the Central Pacific. They didn't have to pay for their own food. They lived in mobile camps that moved with the rail line, and they died just like everybody else when things went wrong. The camps were rough, bunkhouses on wheels, essentially railroad cars converted into dormitories. Men slept in bunks stacked 3 high. The smell was overwhelming. Sweat, unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and the accumulated stench of men who worked 14-hour days and rarely had access to bathing water. The food was basic: beans, salt pork, bread, coffee, designed for calories, not flavor. Scurvy was a constant problem until someone figured out to include dried fruit in the rations. Dysentery swept through camps when water supplies got contaminated. Violence was common. Men fought over gambling debts, over women in the temporary towns that sprang up along the rail line, over insults real and imagined. Alcohol was everywhere, despite company rules against it. Whiskey peddlers followed the railroad, selling rot-gut liquor that was as likely to blind you as get you drunk. On paydays, men would drink away their earnings and wake up broke, already committed to another month of labor just to pay off the debts they'd accumulated. The mobile nature of the work meant no stability. You'd be in one location for a few weeks or months, then the camp would pack up and move forward with the rails. The towns that formed around the railroad camps were called Hell on Wheels. Temporary settlements made of tents and rough lumber, filled with saloons, brothels, gambling halls, and every form of vice you could imagine. They'd exist for a few months, then disappear when the railroad moved on, leaving behind nothing but trash piles and memories. The Union Pacific faced different problems than the Central Pacific. The terrain was flatter, but the Sioux and Cheyenne nations weren't happy about a railroad cutting through their land. Construction crews worked with armed guards watching for attacks. Men died in raids. Others died from disease, accidents, and the kind of stupid mistakes that happen when you're exhausted and working with heavy equipment in the middle of nowhere. But the biggest killer was the work itself, the repetitive, relentless, body-destroying work of driving spikes. Your hands went numb from the vibration. Your elbows developed chronic pain that never went away. Your back seized up from bending over thousands of times a day. Older workers developed what we'd now call repetitive stress injuries. Their bodies just gave out. Tendons snapped, joints wore down to bone on bone, and when a man couldn't swing a hammer anymore, he was done. No pension, no disability pay, just fired and left wherever the railroad happened to be when his body quit. On April 28, 1869, the Central Pacific staged a demonstration that showed exactly what this work could do to men when you pushed them hard enough. Charles Crocker bet the Union Pacific that his crews could lay 10 miles of track in a single day. It had never been done. Most people thought it was impossible. Crocker picked his 8 best rail handlers, Irish workers, every one of them, men who'd been laying rail for years and knew the rhythm like breathing. At 7 a.m. they started. A single horse pulled a flat car loaded with rails to the front of the line. 8 men, 4 on each side of the track, grabbed the rails with tongs. 2 men at the front, 2 at the back. They'd trot forward 30 feet, drop the rail into position, and the spikers behind them would drive it home. Then they'd trot back for the next rail. Over and over. The rails weighed 560 pounds each. Each of those 8 men lifted 125 tons of iron during that day. Plus, they walked the length of the rails they carried, which was way more than 10 miles when you counted all the back and forth. They laid 10 miles and 56 feet of track in one day, used 25,800 ties, 3,520 rails, 55,000 spikes, 14,080 bolts. Total weight of materials moved, 4,462,000 pounds. The track went down at the rate of almost a mile an hour. When they finished, a locomotive ran back over the new track at 40 miles an hour, just to prove it was solid. The Irish rail handlers were heroes that day. They rode in a wagon through Sacramento, while crowds cheered. They'd done something impossible, and proved that when you pushed men hard enough, they could accomplish anything. What the crowds didn't see was what happened after. Those men were wrecked, completely used up. The kind of physical exhaustion that takes weeks to recover from. Their hands were swollen to twice their normal size. fingers locked in positions shaped by hours of gripping iron tongs, their backs seized up so badly some of them couldn't stand upright for days, muscle tears, tendon strains, joints inflamed from the constant impact and stress. One man supposedly pissed blood for 3 days afterward from the sheer physical trauma to his system. The company gave them a bonus, $50 extra, about $1,000 in today's money. It was good pay for 1 day's work, but it wasn't enough to compensate for what that day cost them physically. Some of those men never fully recovered. Their bodies had been pushed past the breaking point and something fundamental had broken. They'd work for a few more years at reduced capacity, the pain never quite going away, until finally they just couldn't do it anymore. And the Chinese workers who'd done all the grading, laid all the ties, driven most of the spikes, and done the actual hard work that made that demonstration possible. They weren't invited to the celebration. They weren't in any of the photographs. When the famous picture was taken at Promontory Summit on May 10, 1869, showing the two locomotives meeting nose to nose and all the workers and company men celebrating, there's not a single Chinese face in the crowd. The men who'd done 90% of the work weren't considered important enough to be in the photo that commemorated their accomplishment. Photographer Andrew Russell set up his camera to capture the moment. He positioned the locomotives just right, got all the important railroad executives in frame, made sure the ceremonial spikes were visible, and then he took one of the most famous photographs in American history. A photograph that told a lie by omission. It showed the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad as an achievement of white Americans, when the truth was that the railroad was built primarily by Chinese and Irish immigrants who weren't considered important enough to include in the official record. Let's talk about what that accomplishment actually meant. The Transcontinental Railroad cut travel time from New York to San Francisco from 6 months to 1 week. Before the railroad, getting to California meant either a wagon journey that took 6 months and killed a significant percentage of travelers, or a ship voyage around Cape Horn that took even longer and cost a fortune. The railroad made the trip in 7 days for a ticket price of $150 first class, $70 for emigrants, expensive but accessible. It made shipping goods across the country economically viable for the first time. Wheat from the Midwest could reach eastern markets without spoiling. Cattle could be moved from western ranges to Chicago stockyards and then to dinner tables in New York. Goods manufactured in eastern factories could reach western customers without the prohibitive shipping costs that had made most products unaffordable. The railroad didn't just connect the coasts, it created a truly national economy for the first time in American history. It opened the West to settlement and industrialization at a pace that would have been impossible otherwise. Towns sprang up along the railroad line, placed exactly where the railroad companies wanted them. The companies owned vast tracts of land granted by the federal government, and they sold that land to settlers who needed access to the railroad to survive. Farmers, ranchers, miners, merchants, all of them depended on the railroad for their economic viability. The environmental and human cost was staggering. The buffalo herds that had sustained the Plains tribes for generations were hunted to near extinction, in part because railroad companies encouraged buffalo hunting as sport, and because the U.S. government saw destroying the buffalo as a way to force native peoples onto reservations. The Sioux, Cheyenne, Pawnee, and other nations saw their lands divided and their way of life destroyed by the railroad and the settlement it enabled. When every major city in the West exists because of that railroad or the railroads that came after it. San Francisco, Los Angeles, Denver, Salt Lake City, Phoenix, all of them grew into major population centers because railroads connected them to the rest of the country. The economic boom the Transcontinental triggered was worth billions in today's dollars. It accelerated the settlement of the West by decades. It made the United States into a continental power in ways that would have been impossible without that iron connection from coast to coast. And it was built by men whose names we don't even know, using tools that would be considered primitive by modern standards, working under conditions that would violate every labor law we have, men who drove 18 million spikes by hand, 3 swings at a time until their bodies gave out. By 1870, The work was done, the spikes were driven, the rails were laid. The two lines met at Promontory Summit in Utah. Leland Stanford, president of the Central Pacific, drove a ceremonial golden spike with a silver hammer. Except he didn't actually drive it. Gold is soft. You can't hammer gold through a railroad tie, so they tapped it gently into pre-drilled holes, took the photo, and pulled it back out. Then a real worker drove a real iron spike to actually complete the connection. And what happened to all those workers? The Chinese workers dispersed across the West. Some stayed with the railroads, working on the dozens of branch lines that got built in the 1870s and 1880s. Others opened laundries, restaurants, small businesses in the Chinatowns that sprang up in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle. They sent money home to China. They tried to bring their families over, and in 1882, the United States Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, banning all immigration from China for the next 60 years. The law was accompanied by violence. In California alone, there were over 200 roundups of rural Chinese communities, lynchings, forced expulsions. Chinese workers were beaten, robbed, murdered. The contribution they'd made to building America was forgotten, deliberately erased. For over 100 years, most Americans had no idea that Chinese workers built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad. It just wasn't taught in schools, wasn't mentioned in history books. The famous photograph didn't include them, so people assumed they weren't there. It took until 2014 for the U.S. Department of Labor to induct Chinese railroad workers into its Hall of Honor. It took until the 151st anniversary of the railroad's completion in 2019 for a concerted effort to correct the historical record, to acknowledge that without Chinese workers, the Central Pacific would never have made it through the Sierra Nevada, to admit that the men who died blasting tunnels through granite and hanging off cliffs on rope baskets to set explosives deserved more than a footnote in somebody else's history. The Irish workers didn't fare much better. They got better pay and better treatment than the Chinese workers, but they were still just labor to the men who owned the railroads. When the Transcontinental was finished, most of them moved on to the next railroad project. There was always another line being built somewhere, always more spikes to drive. Some of them worked on railroads for decades. I'm moving from project to project, their bodies breaking down a little more each year until they couldn't work anymore. No pension, no retirement, just used up and discarded. And the convict laborers like John Henry, they died in numbers we'll never know because nobody kept records. Prison labor was cheap. Deaths were expected. When a man died on the railroad, the prison just sent another one to replace him. The companies got their labor. The prisons got rid of their inmates, and the convicts got buried in unmarked graves at the sites where they died. Here's what's left of all that work. If you walk along old railroad grades in the Sierra Nevada, you can still find rusted spikes, half buried in dirt where old track used to be. The ties have rotted away, the rails have been pulled up and reused or scrapped, but the spikes remain. Little pieces of steel that once held together the thing that changed America. You can hold one in your hand. Feel the weight of it. Try to imagine swinging a hammer hard enough to drive that spike through wood, and then imagine doing it 10,000 times in a single day. Museums have spike malls on display. You can lift one. Feel how heavy 10 pounds is when it's at the end of a 3-foot handle. Try to swing it a few times, and you'll understand pretty quickly why the men who did this work developed permanent injuries. Your hands, your wrists, your elbows, your shoulders, your back, every part of your body involved in that swing takes impact and wears down a little with each hit. Now, multiply that by millions of spikes, and you start to understand the physical cost of building something that big. There are memorials now, on statues to John Henry in West Virginia, where tourists stop to take pictures and read plaques that tell a sanitized version of his story. Plaques commemorating Chinese railroad workers at Promontory Summit, installed in 2019 for the 150th anniversary of the railroad's completion. Museums that tell the story of the Transcontinental Railroad with at least some acknowledgement that the workers who built it were more than just statistics. But for every named individual we can identify, there are thousands whose names are lost. Men who came from China, Ireland, Germany, Scandinavia, former slave states. Men who needed work and took the only jobs available. Men who drove spikes until their bodies broke and then disappeared into history. In 2014, descendants of Chinese railroad workers organized a recreation of the famous Promontory Summit photograph. They gathered at the site with about 200 participants, many of them descendants of the workers whose faces were missing from the original image. They posed in period clothing, standing where their ancestors should have been standing in 1869. It was a powerful act of historical correction, a way of saying that the story of the Transcontinental Railroad is incomplete without acknowledging who actually built it. Photographer Corky Lee, who organized many of these commemoration events, first saw the original Promontory photograph when he was in junior high school. It bothered him that there were no Chinese faces in the image. For decades, he worked to correct that historical erasure, and organizing annual reenactments and pushing for greater recognition of Chinese workers' contributions. His work helped shift public understanding of who built America's railroads and who deserves credit for that achievement. Stanford University, named after Leland Stanford, who was Central Pacific's president and drove the ceremonial Golden Spike, now hosts the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project. Researchers are trying to reconstruct the lives of the men who built the railroad, piecing together names and stories from fragments of documentation, family oral histories, and archival records that survived. It's painstaking work because the railroad companies kept so few records of individual workers. But slowly, names are emerging. Stories are being told. The erasure is being reversed, at least partially. The work matters because it changes how we understand American history. For generations, children were taught that the Transcontinental Railroad was an achievement of American ingenuity and determination, with no mention that the people who actually did the work were mostly immigrants, and that many of them died in the process. That incomplete history allowed Americans to celebrate the railroad without confronting the human cost of building it or acknowledging the contributions of people who weren't white and weren't considered real Americans at the time. The railroad they built is still there. Much of the original route is still in use. The Union Pacific still exists as a company. The Central Pacific was absorbed into Southern Pacific and eventually into Union Pacific. Trains still run from California to Nebraska, carrying freight that keeps the modern economy running. Every time a train passes over track that follows the original transcontinental route, it's running on the alignment chosen by surveyors in the 1860s, over roadbed prepared by workers with shovels and wheelbarrows, on rails secured by spikes that were driven by men whose names we'll never know. And that's the thing that separates this generation from ours. We don't build things by hand anymore. We've got machines for everything. Mechanized spike drivers that can secure a mile of track in a day with 2 operators, automated systems that lay rail faster than those 8 Irish workers managed even on their record-breaking day. We've engineered the human cost out of the equation, which is good. We should be glad nobody has to destroy their body-driving spikes anymore. But something got lost in that transition. Not the work itself. Nobody should romanticize backbreaking labor. But the knowledge that certain kinds of massive projects could be accomplished through sheer human determination, one spike at a time. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1,907 days from groundbreaking to Golden Spike. That's just over 5 years. In that time, working with nothing but hand tools, animal power, and black powder explosives, workers graded 1,907 miles of roadbed, laid millions of ties, placed hundreds of thousands of rails, and drove somewhere around 18 million spikes. Every single one by hand. 3 swings of a hammer, 10 pounds of force, millions upon millions of times. The men who did it were not heroes. They were just working men doing dangerous work for wages. But the scale of what they accomplished is almost incomprehensible to modern thinking. We look at a project like that now and immediately start calculating how many machines we'd need, how much automation, how we could minimize the human labor involved. They didn't have any of those options. It was just muscle, sweat, and the stubborn belief that if you put enough men with enough hammers in front of a big enough problem, eventually you'd beat it. They were right. They did beat it. And the proof is still there every time a freight train crosses the country in 3 days carrying goods that connect the economy from coast to coast. That train is riding on their work, on the 18 million spikes they drove, on the bodies they used up and the lives they sacrificed to make it happen. If you've got family stories from the railroad, grandparents or great-grandparents who worked laying track, driving spikes, or just surviving in the camps where this work got done, you should tell those stories. Write them down, record them, because the railroad companies didn't keep records of most of the workers, didn't care enough about them as individuals to document who they were or what they did. The only way we know anything about them now is through family history and oral tradition. The spikes are still out there, buried in dirt or rusting in museums. Little pieces of steel that once held together the thing that connected America. They weigh half a pound each, 10 million of them. That's 5 million pounds of steel, all driven by hand, 3 swings at a time, by men who knew that the work would break them but did it anyway because the alternative was starvation. They're gone now. All of them. The last workers who helped build the Transcontinental Railroad died decades ago. Their names are mostly lost. Their graves are mostly unmarked. The railroad they built has been rebuilt, upgraded, and modernized so many times that almost nothing of the original construction remains visible. But if you know where to look, you can still find the traces. The grades cut through mountainsides, the fills across valleys, the tunnels blasted through solid rock, and the spikes, always the spikes, half buried in the ground, waiting for someone to pick them up and remember that every one of them was driven by a man who deserved better than to be forgotten. That's the real legacy of the Transcontinental Railroad. Not the golden spike or the famous photograph or the celebration at Promontory Summit. The real legacy is in the work itself, in the stubborn, repetitive, body-destroying labor of building something that big with nothing but hand tools and human muscle, in the knowledge that it can be done if you're willing to pay the price, and in the fact that the price was paid by men who had no choice, who were never given credit, and who died building something they'd never be allowed to fully participate in. 18 million spikes, 18 million times a hammer came down, and every single one of them was driven by someone who deserved to have their name remembered.